Good morning and welcome to Knowledge Miles, the 695th Lord Mayor's Lectures. Today we have a great lecture, the Thames Barrier, immediate future or long past. In this free online lecture series, we are addressing the connections in and around the square mile, the world's coffee house, and how these might help us to tackle future global challenges. I'm Martin Bigg, and I'm Master of the Worshipful Company of Water Conservators and Professor of Environmental Technologies Innovation at the University of the West of England in Bristol. I'll be convening this session and moderating the questions and answers portion of today's lecture. But before we begin, a bit of housekeeping from me. We have about 25 minutes for the lecture and about 10-15 minutes for questions. So please be thinking of questions as we go. Oh, and please, short questions, not statements. Many thanks. But without further ado, let me introduce the speaker for today's lecture. We are delighted to welcome Professor Carolyn Roberts, Fleet Warden of the Worshipful Company of Water Conservators and Professor Emerita of Environment and Fellow of Gresham College, London. But we'll start with a short video.
Has quickly altered its course. It's likely to hit the southeastern coast later this afternoon.
You're on the point.
This storm and the tidal surge happening with it will reach southeast England
At high.
The volume of water
Will overwhelm the Thames Barrier.
Central London is now at risk.
I'm afraid I am.
Take the family, get in the car, and get far away from London as you can.
And state of emergency.
On an unprecedented scale.
What does this mean? What is the population?
Approximately 1.5 million people.
We have to get these people out of here.
This thing isn't over.
Are you saying we haven't seen the worst of it?
Could take us to the city.
It's heading for us.
run.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for staying with me for at least the first 2 minutes of the film. This seminar, this workshop, is based. Well, it's going to give you a quick romp through some of the issues to do with the Thames Barrier. I'm hoping that it won't upset people in the way that the that the trailer of the film there might have done. The work that I'm going to talk about is based on something funded by the National Preparedness Commission, and it's courtesy of them, and is based on research on large number of publications, hundreds, if possibly 1,000 publications, and a series of interviews with people who are involved in the management of the Thames Barrier and the associated infrastructure. Now, it won't be like the movie. If there is a flood, it won't be like the movie. But nevertheless, people are living in a floodplain. If you live in London, I'll show you a map in a minute, you are living in a floodplain, and flooding is a matter of probability. It does happen on floodplains. And I've put "and will" question mark there in brackets. It will happen. It might happen. And exactly what happens, the way it plays out, is something I'm going to talk about in a minute. But there are certain key issues that come out of that movie, which, however improbable it seems, are quite pertinent. So the time of day for evacuation, the kind of event that this is, the extent of failures. We saw there a massive tidal surge coming up the estuary, but some failures are local. We'll look at some pictures of that in a minute. It depends on everybody's level of preparedness. It depends on political challenges, disbelief in some cases. It depends on prioritizations, what is to be saved and what not. And it depends very extensively on cooperation amongst organisations. Something that was very evident following the very serious flooding in Gloucestershire in 2007, where I was privileged enough to be the advisor to the county council after the event, I should say, not beforehand. Cooperation absolutely key. Now, I mentioned there political challenges and disbelief. Politics is involved a lot in discussions about flooding. Flooding is a genuinely wicked problem where there are physical elements and political or attitudinal issues as well. The cartoon here, I'll move on swiftly. Boris is a good target, isn't he, for flooding? And this was a cartoon produced a few years ago now. It's not the first time we've had cartoons about flooding, though. Here's a cartoon based, I think, in 1888. It was in Punch magazine, talking about who's to blame. And as you see the little the text underneath the picture there, London, the woman in the crown is saying there, "Out of your bed again, you troublesome old lunatic. Do you want to drown us all?" And there's Father Thames saying, "I ain't responsible. It's somebody's business to see me safely tucked in both sides." So cartoons have been a long-standing issue. And who's to blame for flooding is a long-standing issue as well. Now, who's to blame? Well, the physical characteristics of what causes flooding in the Thames area are quite clear. The images that we see here, they're scientific images. If you look across the top row of the images, you can see the pressure system in the colours and the arrows showing the wind direction of very serious flooding in the Thames in 1953. I'll show you some images of that in a minute, but you'll see that the low pressure centred over the North Sea and the wind pushing water down into the southern part of the North Sea and then up into the Thames estuary. Across the bottom line is a very similar event that took place in 2013, and we'll come back to that in a minute as well. If you look carefully at the colours, you'll see the event actually was slightly wider in scope. The blue area is larger. The winds were pretty strong, rather similar to the 1953 event, but there was no serious flooding, certainly not in central London, on that event. Now, let's just look at some pictures of previous events. Now, here's the two events I want to just show you images of. 1928, very serious flooding in central London. There was a breach in the embankment at Westminster. You can see there the broken wall behind behind what I think is looks like an army officer and a resident and some other residents. You can see the broken wall there. You can see that from the, if you can read the caption that I've put on here, the in 1928 the embankment previously that had been uninhabited and had been reclaimed during Victorian times now had a lot of houses on it, and when it flooded 14 people died and about 4,000 people were made homeless, and there was an awful lot of damage. It wasn't only houses and businesses, there was also damage to some of our heritage. So the Tate Gallery, for example, flooded. It might have not been such a good idea to keep the collection of Turners in the basement, in fact, and quite a lot of them were damaged, and a large number of other paintings as well. Fortunately, the Turners were able to be restored. So we've got in the floodable area for 1928 a lot of heritage. There was interruption to business. This is people attempting to get along the embankment after that flooding in February, I guess on their way to work. And if you look at the image, you can see the very wide extent of the flooding there. There were rescues. Here's the 1928 rescue. You can see there a horse and cart, people punting along. Look, the upper floors, you can see people in what were then houses, rather mean-looking houses in the city in 1928. People on the upper floors, right at the top there, waiting to be rescued. Like this cartoon, this is Miss Frankius, who apparently saved a lot of people personally whilst the police stood by, but she was a very brave lady. The middle image there showing her having been lowered down from an upper floor, pulling Mrs. Watson and her boy out of the lower floor of a building. But this was a big issue. It was a big deal in 1928. And here we see a rescue. There's a man who looks rather pleased with himself halfway down the ladder there, and Grandma coming down afterwards, and other people waiting to be rescued onto the horse and cart. So that was 1928. Now, did it change? Well, here's 1953. It's almost identical image. Serious flooding in 1953 that we saw in the science picture earlier. And you can see here people climbing out of upstairs windows. There's a rather alarmed looking baby in the arms of the man there, and I don't blame it. It looks pretty dodgy to me. But the lower part of the area there in front of these houses is flooded, and the floods killed over 300 people in eastern England, not just in central London, in fact less in central London, mostly in the estuary. There was widespread flooding in places like Tilbury, and there were some attempts to have an emergency response. I can't imagine today's students perhaps stepping up in quite the same way as they did in February 1953 to fill sandbags, but there were attempts to stop the floodwaters, largely unsuccessful, actually. Now, let's just look at a map. Here's a map of the area of the Thames and the Thames estuary that has an estimated recurrence interval for flooding, the likelihood of flooding, of once in 1,000 years. So the blue areas without any defences are likely to be flooded once in 1,000 years, and you can see it's a very large area covering a lot of the Thames estuary. The little red mark in the middle of the diagram there, the middle of the map, is where the current Thames Barrier is. So you can see actually that the larger area of flooding is not in central London, although that's where a lot of the value of buildings and other things on the floodplain sits. A lot of the area is to the east of the Thames, where the Thames Barrier is today. If we focus in a little bit, it's the same area, or the central area there. Here's a map of the estimated flood risk without protection in 2030, and we'll come back to the reasons for that in a minute, produced by NASA. And you can see very large areas, less of the city, but particularly on the south bank and around Battersea, Fulham, Hammersmith, and so on, Vauxhall. and east, to the east as well, Stratford, Plaistow, Greenwich and so on. So without any flood protection. Now, of course, today we now have flood protection. We have the Thames Barrier, opened officially in 1984, and a genuinely remarkable structure, a feat of UK engineering, if you like. I'll show you the details of it in a minute, what it consists of, but you can see the basic principle here. We're looking upstream here, and the barrier is, at the moment, is not in operation. It's low tide. You can see on the left-hand side some of the bed of the Thames exposed there, and you can see in the upstream area the intensity, partly of the intensity of the built-up area. When it's closed, you can see here, if you look at the between those ship's hull shaped steel covers, you can see the barrier there. Most of the barriers shut. There's one still, I think, not quite shut in the image there. But what's it doing? How does it work? Well, forgive me, those of you who know a lot about this will understand this. When it was built, it was designed to protect for a 1 in 1,000 year event, a flood we might expect as a statistical probability once in 1,000 years. It's very big, 520 meters wide. It has a series of gates. The most important ones are what are called the rising sector gates, and they sit in the base of the Thames, in the bed of the Thames, and then they are pulled open into a closed position before the high tide is expected, if the Met Office, the meteorological office, are predicting a high flow. So you can see there it's closing and it's closed, and it takes an hour and a half fully to close it. So, and the timing of the closure has to be modelled, because we don't want the upstream area to fill up with flow of water coming down the river either. So the timing of that closure is quite important. Below the barrier, we've got embankments at just over 7 meters, which matches the protection area of the barrier itself. So that's how it's intended to work. Rising sector gates to allow shipping through. When it was planned, designed, shipping, big ships in the Thames were a major phenomenon. And here you can see the mechanism, and again some of you will be familiar with this. Is one here pulling up one or two of the gates, the rising sector gates, pulling them up, huge sort of pistons pulling them up out of the bed of the stream. So it is a massive feat of engineering, as you can see here. The gates can be over rotated. This is a nice picture here showing how they maintain them. People hanging off the gates. They've been rotated up above the river. In fact, they can be over rotated just above the sort of maximum vertical extension. It can be over rotated. This is completely over rotated to allow some cleaning and maintenance and so on. And of course, as you've seen if you concentrated on the fast-moving video at the beginning, you'll also realise there were some tunnels, and there are indeed tunnels underneath the barrier. I remember walking through these in 1982, which was quite a sharp experience actually. But there are lots of tunnels underneath the barrier. But of course, it's not just the Thames Barrier. There are in fact 8 other barriers on various tributaries of the Thames. There are some 200 miles of embankments and walls, many of which are in private ownership, and actually when they were assessed in 2021, 2.5% of them were found to be not actually working at their target level of maintenance, if you like, which is obviously a source of some concern. There are 400 other structures, floodgates, outfalls, pumps and so on. And there are also today, importantly, which less important or regarded as less important in the past, some buffer areas of ecological interest, some salt marsh areas. not considered in the 1970s because the environmental implications of the Thames Barrier really wasn't part of the agenda then, but today it is, and in fact some of these salt marsh areas have increased a little in size, so that's a part, if you like, part of the protection area because they would absorb some water. Now, let's just look at the barrier itself. As I said, this is generally regarded as a world-class structure, and if you look at films or little clips on the internet about it, you will hear engineers saying it cannot fail, it will not fail. I personally always get slightly nervous when I hear statements about that, but let's take that at face value. It cannot fail. It has lots of backup technology. I think there are 4 kinds of ways in which the gates can be raised if the power supply should fail in one. Various backups. So fully functional for 1984. It's protecting a very large amount of property, £321 billion, about 1.5 million people. That's gone up since the barrier first became operational in 1984. There are 14% more people. 55,000 commercial properties. Again, that's probably difficult to assess, but at least that number. And there are some issues. Climate change is likely to affect the barrier. We'll see a little bit more about this in a minute, but a once in a century sea level event is likely to become a once a year event at some point in the future. And our predictions about climate change are predicting by 2050 5% more winter rain. Now, the way the flooding takes place we'll look at in a minute, but it is often a combination of a tidal surge and heavy rain over the catchment of the Thames, and to a certain extent surface water flooding in the city as well, because the sewers that we have are not able to discharge water into the river because the river level is too high. We'll come back to that in a minute. You can see again on my list of bullet points here, the area now protected, or I should say the area now in the Thames estuary, is managed by something called the Thames Estuary Growth Board, and it is widely publicised as the UK's #1 growth opportunity to attract investment in both businesses and also in often high value residential properties. But also in the area protected by the Thames Barrier, we've got many elements of critical infrastructure: hospitals, schools, transport hubs, businesses, and so on. And in addition to those 1.42 million people who live or work in the potentially floodable area, the floodable area protected by the barrier, and this is the bit upstream, every day approximately 200,000 tourists enter London. That's the 2023 figure, which is actually lower than it has been at various times in the past. Since the pandemic, it's recovering now, but so we've got 200,000 tourists milling around in there as well. We've also got all sorts of other things. We've got 4 World Heritage Sites, 4,000 listed buildings, the centre of our government, and so on. So there is a lot of potentially a lot of structures and people that could potentially be damaged if this 40-year-old structure should fail. Now let's just look at the way it's been operated. Since 1982, and it actually, I think, operated for the first time in 1982, it was fully declared open in 1984, but you can see that when it first operated, in that first 10-year period, it operated on very few occasions. Since then, it's operated a lot more, and it looks as if there's an increasing trend. Now, 2 points I want to make about this. The first being that it was never intended to operate more than a handful of times in a year. And you can see in that period, 2012 to 2022, that it operated over 80 times, often in response to fluvial flooding. Now, if we just look at that in a little more detail, perhaps the story is not quite as sharp or alarming as appears on that diagram I have up at the moment. Here we've got the latest figures until last month, and you can see actually in recent years there have been fewer openings, still more than in the first decade, but the big issue was 2013 to 2014, when the barrier was operated 41 times. So perhaps not quite such a clear trend as we might have anticipated, rather more a sort of flurry of activity and action, and actually publication too, and commentary in 2014 and the year or two after that. Now, is there really a change in the likelihood of flooding? You can see there that the number of times the barrier has been operated, though that's based on prompts by the Met Office that there is likely to be a very severe tide, and other agencies that there's going to be high flow coming down the Thames as well, often. And it's the high flow coming down the Thames actually that's largely responsible for what went on in 2013, 2014, in combination with the tidal events. Is there a change in the likelihood? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. I think in general terms we would say yes. I'm a hydrologist myself, and I, having looked at the data myself, am very conscious that there is a change in the likelihood. And this is partly based on climate change, not entirely based on climate change, but at least in part. The North Sea is getting increasingly stormy. Unfortunately, in this webinar, we don't have time to go into all the details of what's in the climate predictions for this, but the North Sea is getting more stormy, and there is a greater likelihood of storm surges. It's actually proving quite difficult to model that. There is also change in the climate over the Thames Basin. There's a change in rainfall intensity and river flows, but that doesn't quite yet manifest itself in a trend in the records of river flow. There's some suggestion that flow in the Thames is increasing, but perhaps not flood flow. And there's a lot of debate about why that is. It may partly be to do with agricultural practices or development of housing and other forms of development in the catchment area, but it's not coming through strongly in trends in the river flow records. But what is coming through strongly is an overall rise in sea level, my third bullet point there. Ice is melting in the above sea ice caps, and particularly in the southern hemisphere, and more importantly, I think the thermal expansion of seawater as the oceans warm, and that's only the oceans take up a lot of heat, but they are starting to warm. The latest science suggests, and importantly, the rate of rise is accelerating. Now, if we look at the period from round about the 20th century, the average rate of rise was 1.4 millimetres a year. It doesn't sound very much, but if you aggregate that over a century, that's a lot. And more importantly, the period 1990 to 2018, that rate has more than doubled. So this is monitored rate globally. It's around 3.66 millimetres a year. So it's more than doubled. And the Environment Agency are predicting the cumulative rise in the early part of, during the 21st century as being 1.6 metres. And it could be more than that if we get a catastrophic collapse of one of the ice sheets in Antarctica. So 1.6 metres, that's a lot. If I often think one can smile, and I'm sorry about the political element here, but Donald Trump is somebody who's often talked about climate change being a fiction. He's got some property in Florida which is well below the 1.6 metre level. Of course, that's to the end of the century, but it could be higher, as we've said. We've also got something here called isostatic change. Now, this sounds ludicrous, but it is an element. It's a small element of the change in relative sea level. During the last ice age, there were very large amounts of ice on Scotland, and it pushed the Earth's crust down a little. Now we're still recovering from that. So as Scotland rebounds, the south of England is kind of going down. It's tipping slightly, and so that's also adding to the increase in relative sea level. We've got some erosion and deposition across the estuary too. Now there are changes in what's going on in the estuary, in the level of sand and gravel. For example, just outside the curtain wall of the Tower of London, right on the estuary, there is an erosion problem. And speaking to people associated with that, they are concerned in the event of a large tidal surge, lest the curtain wall of the Tower of London collapsed because of erosion underneath the structure. So all of those things are influencing changes in likelihood. We've also got maintenance challenges. I already said to you that the Thames Barrier was never intended to be operated in quite the way and quite the number of occasions it's operated in now. And we've got some evidence that some of the embankments that also protect the Thames below the barrier are deteriorating. When they were last surveyed in 2020, there's some deterioration there, and many of these are in private hands, as I said earlier. There is an issue about whether the Environment Agency has sufficient resources to actually keep track of all of those embankments, 200 miles of embankments. And there's also something else, I think, which I just put in there out of interest, the risk of terrorism, the potential risk of terrorism, which again in the 1970s was not examined. Now, those are changes in, if you like, the physical likelihood. But we've got to also consider the number of organisations that are involved in managing this process of keeping London safe. Now, I'm not going to run through all of these, but you can see here on my slide there are a huge number of organisations. I could have filled several screens with the relevant people. We know this, again, from our experience of other floods and my own personal experience of the flooding in Gloucestershire in 2007. All of these agencies have to work together to make sure that people remain, and property indeed, remains safe. There are some big challenges for being prepared for flooding. I've put a few of them down here. Again, I'm not going to read them all out, but things like, will the infrastructure work as intended? Do people know what to do if there's a risk of flooding or if there is actual flooding? We know that recovery of buildings takes a long time. We know that there is transport disruption. We know that there is economic impact way beyond the area inundated. That was the case in Gloucestershire and certainly would be the case in London. And there are public attitudes which are important as well. Is it worth doing anything? Is it actually worth doing anything? One might speculate on whether the residents of Manchester, having been deprived of the top end of HS2, would think it's appropriate for the government to be investing taxpayers' money in protecting London. Very large amounts of money, much larger than the likelihood of much larger than HS2, for example. So there are public attitudes, and there are ways in which that plays out spatially across the country. And then, of course, there are the responses to climate change. I mean, perhaps sea level won't go on rising if we can reduce our emissions, but there is a big time lag over that. Now, I want to just illustrate the issues about communications between different groups of people. This diagram, this little schematic, is intended to illustrate it. It is actually based on discussions to which I was party. So if you're reading from the left, here you can see somebody who manages a land area below the floodable level that's been developed since the barrier was put in place, since the barrier was built intended to protect areas. And in the event of flooding, this person is saying, well, we would tell our residents to evacuate. It's fine. It's the Docklands Light Railway. It's above ground. It's not the Circle Line. The person in the middle is saying, yes, but we will have to protect our assets by quickly closing down the rail system. And then you see somebody there saying, well, actually, we'll be protecting our assets by shutting off the power. This is the power suppliers. So you might have trouble shutting down the transport network in an orderly way. This is let alone what happens when the communications fail because the electricity fails altogether, and we no longer even have functional mobile phone masts. But there are all sorts of other issues. Will the telecoms be working? Can the staff come to work? Now, I give you that as a hypothetical scenario. It's not that hypothetical. What are we going to do about this? What about the future? Well, what we have, and this is where I think London potentially is a model for other areas of the world, we have something called the 2100 plan and the 10-year review. We have an adaptive pathway where targets evolve and grow, and we have a plan to raise the defences downstream and to reassess our options. This is in the face of, I should say, a lot of misinformation being put out. I don't think it's likely that in 2030 large areas of the country
Carolyn, can I warn you, running out of time?
Yeah, and that's the last slide. Do we need another barrier? Yes, and we could have new barriers. In fact, personally, I think that's going to be necessary, and there's a map there showing where they might be. But those two have implications. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass you back to, or I'll ask the team to
Carolyn,
pass us back.
That was superb. Thank you very much indeed. I can see that there is so much more information there that we could pick up on. And it's an exciting subject. We've got quite a few questions come through already. And the first question I'll pick up on was from Clive Bullen. He lives near the Thames in Twickenham and asks if there are any infrastructure climate changes he should be worrying about, and more importantly, anything he should be doing as an individual.
Well, I don't know that Twickenham is any different to anywhere else. He could have a look at the Environment Agency published maps that are online and see what the risk is to his property. But there are certainly ways of flood-proofing individual properties. They're not expensive and they don't involve sandbags, which to my mind never work. But there are ways of flood-proofing properties, and look at the Environment Agency website for advice on that.
Thanks. Another question from Martin White. Is the Thames Tideway Tunnel going to have any effect on the flood risk?
Short answer, I don't think that's significant, no. Tiny effect perhaps, but insignificant, I would say.
And another one, any comments on the role of the privatised water companies, particularly like the Thames and Essex?
Well, they do have roles, particularly in relation to surface water. In a short webinar like this, even though it's slightly too long, we don't have time to go into the details. But yes, they do have roles, particularly in managing information flows and in managing, if there were an event to take place and there were significant flooding, they would have to be managing the fallout from that in terms of supplying water and, more significantly, as we know from the Gloucestershire event, the effects on sanitation. If you can't have functioning toilets, and that might be well beyond the area inundated, you cannot do anything. You can't live there, you can't run a business, and you rapidly revert to medieval conditions.
Thanks. Another from Matthew Leach. Does anyone know how much the flood defence costs per year, on average, taking account everything, barriers, walls, services? And how is that likely to change because of climate change?
Well, the short answer is I don't know the answer to how much it costs, and I imagine the costs will be distributed across a wide range of organisations, and they will go up because we're going to have to raise the level of protection, because it's no longer protecting against a 1 in 1,000 year event. So we will have to do that. I was speaking to the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission yesterday about this, and I think costs are likely to be significant. And as I said before, who is going to pay for it is a big issue, I think.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got another question. Sorry, the questions are flying in here, but thanks for dealing with it so quickly. This is from Yusuf Samula, are there regular flood response exercises which also alert the general public to the process? Or would that just introduce public panic?
Well, that's a really interesting question, actually. There was intended to be what's called a desktop area, but a desktop simulation event with a number of the involved organisations. But I gather it was postponed because of the death of the late Queen, and there is scheduled to be another one shortly, actually, or at least two. But as far as I know, there's been no public testing, and that is a big issue. If you imagine somebody running a large hotel in the floodable area, it's quite possible that their staff might know what to do in the event of an imminent risk of flooding. But what would be done with, as I said, 200,000 tourists in central London at any one time is anybody's guess. It's a major challenge. How much warning would we get? Maybe 24 hours. And where would these people go is a very interesting question. So we are very dependent on that physical infrastructure, because other things, emergency responses, are going to be very difficult indeed, and even very difficult to test. There's a reluctance to test them too because of the risk of deterring tourism, and we're very dependent on tourism as a country for income. So interesting and challenging question, that one.
Okay. Last question I think we've got time for. The 2007 Gloucester flooding impacted public water supplies, 300,000 without water, and
Indeed.
a recent event near Guildford. Are there similar vulnerabilities in London?
Well, there will be, yes. I don't know actually where they are, where exactly they are, and but I would point out that in the Gloucestershire event, one of the major water supplies was taken out as the questioner clearly is aware, for a very large number of people, and they became dependent on airdrops of drinking water and distribution by water bowsers. The police noted very quickly that they were on the edge of what they called civil disobedience. In fact, there were some water bowsers were vandalised. Water bowsers in areas regarded as the residences of wealthier people were vandalised, presumably by residents who felt that they had been less well treated because the streets were narrower, and actually it was more difficult to get water bowsers into them, or so it was said. But there is a risk of civil disobedience, yes, and in fact I just refer you back to the short and rather alarming film at the beginning of the webinar. Civil disobedience, yes, I think that's a genuine possibility if the technology and the collaboration should fail.
Carolyn, that is superb. It's clear that we are all worried about London, and there is just so much that we could probably talk about on potential flooding and what we can do about it. and we'll pass the questions on to Carolyn afterwards to see what else she can follow up on. And if you want to know more, then please, the water conservators do a lot for water and the environment, promoting a sustainable and diverse environment. So if you want to join us or want to find out more about us, please contact our clerk. The details on the screen now. This lecture and all the lectures are recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel in case you want to revisit anything. So first of all, my thanks. My thanks to you, our audience, for your interest, your engagement, and for the questions. Thank you to Professor Carolyn Roberts for such a fascinating and superb presentation. And finally, a brief look at the forthcoming lectures in the series on the screen now. And you'll see we've got everything around journalism, tomorrow's future, growing cities, and a modern city. And clearly, this is all about London, the city to come to, the centre for discussion, the knowledge mile, and sharing the knowledge within the city. So we hope to see you again at another lecture in the Knowledge Mile series. But meanwhile, my time has run out. So thank you very much for joining us, and good morning to you all.